Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this presentation about my PhD project. I'm Hanneke van het Veen. I was a PhD student for 4 years at the Earth System Sciences group of the University of Zurich. And I'm looking forward to present some of my findings to you during this presentation. On the picture here, you can see a charcoal production system where charcoal producers, the people, are producing charcoal from the trees in their village. And what is special about this particular picture is that a local NGO has come into the village to provide these charcoal producers with a training on sustainable charcoal production. And the aim of this local NGO is basically to transition this charcoal production system from a state that is perhaps a little bit less sustainable, where forests are lost or heavily degraded, for example, to a more sustainable state where forest loss and degradation are being mitigated, but at the same time, people can continue to produce charcoal to provide for their daily needs, their livelihoods. And this is basically what my PhD has been about. It has been about these charcoal production systems and the transitions in them and the effect that these transitions have on forests and on livelihoods. But what is the charcoal that I'm talking about? The charcoal that I'm talking about is the charcoal that is produced from woody biomass resources, usually from trees that grow in forests or in plantations. And these trees are basically cut down and carbonized in a special oven, which is called a kiln. And then after carbonization, the charcoal is gathered from this kiln and transported to centers of demand where it's used as an energy source for cooking, for example, or for industry. Now, the space where charcoal is produced is called a charcoal production site, and it usually looks a little bit like this, where you have a harvesting area where the trees are cut to produce charcoal. And then you also have either the kiln present, the carbonization oven, or the scar of the kiln will be present. Now, many livelihoods around the world depend very much on the production of charcoal, especially in the tropics. And a livelihood is basically the means of securing the basic necessities of life, the ways in which to secure daily needs. And at the moment, charcoal provides an income source for over 40 million people worldwide and an energy source for hundreds of millions of people. And this results in the production of about 50 million tons of charcoal per year, which equals 300 cubic meters of roundwood per year. And at the moment, a reduction in charcoal production is very unlikely to occur soon because rather an increase, a rise in demand has been predicted with about 5% by the year 2100. So it is very unlikely that we will soon transition from charcoal as an energy source to an alternative energy source such as fossil fuels or other types of renewable energy. Now, on the one hand, this provides a lot of opportunities because charcoal is first of all so important for all of these hundreds of millions of livelihoods, but also because it could be a sustainable energy source because it is produced from renewable resources that can regrow and recapture the CO2 that will be emitted when you use charcoal as an energy source. So basically it has the potential to be a sustainable energy source. However, at the moment, a lot of production of charcoal occurs in a quite unregulated fashion in what we call open access systems in this thesis, where charcoal producers relatively freely access the forests to produce charcoal under limited adherence to existing laws, rules, and regulations. Now, this unregulated production, together with very high demands for charcoal, can have negative implications for the forest because it may lead to overexploitation of these forest resources. And currently, about 7% of deforestation is attributable to charcoal production. And charcoal production also causes quite some forest degradation and ecosystem services loss, such as a loss of biodiversity and carbon sequestration, for example. Now, to mitigate this negative implications for the forests, transitions are being initiated by governments, by NGOs and other agencies from these more unregulated open access systems to alternative charcoal production systems. And one way to transition such a charcoal production system is by through a governance transition where you implement new laws, rules, and regulations for the production of charcoal. What we find in this thesis is that on the one hand, theoretically, such governance transitions have the potential to prevent forest loss and degradation at very high demands for charcoal, while continuing to allow for the production of charcoal on the long term. So on the one hand, these governance transitions could work very well and could actually foster sustainability in these systems, even at high levels of demand. However, on the other hand, we also show in this thesis that empirically governance has quite limited effects on charcoal production at a large scale at the moment. So we show that the governance in real life has not so much effects on charcoal production yet. So this indicates that there is basically a need to understand how can we transition charcoal production systems to more alternative charcoal production systems that are more sustainable on a large scale, and how can we foster these transitions better so that there is basically more that governance has more power to influence charcoal. And therefore, there is basically a need to better understand the effects of governance transitions, for example, on the way we use forests for charcoal production, and also on the livelihoods of charcoal production producers, to see, okay, what works and what does not work, perhaps, and how can we foster these transitions in real life. Now, one way to do this is by looking into a local field study, because this allows for the comparison between two types of charcoal production systems that are under similar conditions. For example, similar socioeconomic, cultural, and political conditions, for example. And we decided to do just that by going to a field study site in Tanzania, in Eastern Africa, where we assessed 6 villages, 3 under open access, which we call OA villages from now on, and 3 under an alternative charcoal production system, which was in this case communal management. And we call these communal management villages CB villages. So basically what this allowed us to do was compare these open access villages with these communal management villages. But what is communal management? Well, communal management is basically the decentralized governance of the forest by a local community, in this case, a village. So it is the decentralized governance by the village leaders, the village governments, and also, in this case, the charcoal producers, for example. And this is done through participatory forestry by implementing a harvesting plan that indicates where charcoal should be produced, how it should be produced, and by whom it should be produced, etc. And at the same time, formal institutions are being implemented, such as charcoal producer associations, where charcoal producers can come together to make shared decisions about the use of the forests. What is very important for communal management to work very well is that then social networks are present locally to promote effective decentralization and participation. So these dense social networks allow charcoal producers and their village government to collaborate with each other to make sure that they follow the harvesting plan that is implemented. What's special about this particular communal management scheme is that it is implemented by a local NGO called Tanzania Forest Conservation Group. And Tanzania Forest Conservation Group basically helped the villages, many villages in Tanzania, to delineate their forested land. In light gray here, and also to delineate within this forested land a designated area for charcoal production in dark gray here. And within this designated production, charcoal is allowed to produce. So charcoal producers are allowed to produce charcoal only in these designated areas. And within these designated areas, charcoal producers are allowed to produce in 50 by 50 meter harvesting blocks that are alternating basically in a checkerboard pattern. And then additional rules are there, of course, such as no cutting near waterways, no cutting of timber trees, etc., which results in more selective cutting of trees, where some trees remain in the harvesting areas and some trees are cut. What this allowed us, basically, this sort of like almost experimental setup allowed us to do was to compare forest use and livelihoods of charcoal producers between these open access villages and these communal management villages. And what we were interested in this thesis was forest use in terms of the charcoal production patterns in these villages and the compliance of laws, rules, and regulations by charcoal producers. And we were interested in livelihoods in terms of the socioeconomic and ecological benefits charcoal producers obtain from charcoal production under these different governance regimes. So what we basically assumed was that if we found statistically significant differences that were consistent between these two village types, that we could attribute these differences to the governance that has been implemented or that is not being adhered to, for example, in the case of the open access systems. Now, to gather data on forest use and livelihoods, we adopted sort of like an overarching approach, which is called the sustainable livelihood approach. And the sustainable livelihood approach basically allows for the gathering of data in a quite systematic way, which allows for the statistical comparison of livelihood, for example, between these villages. What the sustainable livelihood approach does is that it categorizes livelihoods in different livelihood resources, which are called capitals in this approach. And usually researchers look at 5 different capitals. First of all, there is financial capital, which is basically the income charcoal producers receive from charcoal production. There is physical capital, which is the physical assets of charcoal producers, including their homes, for example, but also transportation and infrastructure. Then there is natural capital, which is basically the forest in this case, from which charcoal is produced. There is social capital, which are the social relations between charcoal producers, which form their social networks basically, but also their norms and values, etc. And then finally, there is human capital, which is basically the knowledge charcoal producers may have about the forests and about charcoal production, as well as the skills they may have in charcoal production and their general health. What is assumed under the sustainable livelihood approach is that people, in this case charcoal producers, need access to all of the livelihood resources, so all of these capitals, to foster a sustainable livelihood. And we also assume this to be true in this thesis. To gather data on both forest use and livelihoods, we adopted 2 main approaches. First of all, we developed a remote sensing method to detect forest use for charcoal production, so to detect the charcoal production sites using satellite imagery. And secondly, we conducted surveys on these livelihoods capitals, where we conducted 160 surveys spread over the 6 villages, which included questions about all 5 of the capitals that I just introduced. And what we were able to do was combine these questions into indicators that were statistically comparable between these villages, so that we could assess the difference between the village in terms of forest use. Here you can see some of the results we obtained for the survey. Here you can see a radar plot with 6 lines in it, which represent the villages basically. The orange lines are for the open access villages, and the green lines are for the communal management villages. And around this radar plot, you can see a range of abbreviations, which are basically indicators that we compared between the villages for the different livelihood capitals. And the indicators have a specific color coding corresponding to the capital that they concern. And the point for each line for the indicator indicates basically the average response of the charcoal producers for these different questions. The first thing that you may notice is that in communal management, there is a relatively higher score, relatively higher on 2 of the natural capital indicators than the communal management villages. And basically, this indicates that these communal management villages statistically score much higher on these in these two natural capital indicators than the open access villages. And what this indicates to us is that in communal management villages, charcoal producers on average feel that their forest had and will have enough trees to produce charcoal. So basically, they feel that the forest has been managed sustainably in the past and will be managed sustainably in the future. While in open access villages, charcoal producers are much more pessimistic about the way that they use the forests. So this is very interesting because this may indicate that in communal management villages, charcoal producers comply with the harvesting plan in place, the communal management plan in place, that regulates where charcoal should be produced, when it should be produced, etc. So it may indicate that charcoal production indeed occurs in these designated areas in these 50 by 50 meter plots, because this scheme has been implemented to foster sustainable charcoal production. Now, to test this, we developed a remote sensing method to detect charcoal production sites. And to develop these remote sensing methods, we used a range of different satellite imagery because we expected these satellites to pick up signals from different aspects of the charcoal production site, basically, because charcoal production sites have these different attributes, such as the harvesting area and the kiln, etc. So first of all, we used Landsat 8 satellite imagery of 30-meter resolution, spatial resolution, which we expected to detect the harvesting area of charcoal production sites because of this relatively coarse resolution. We also used Sentinel-2 satellite imagery, which we expected to detect the surrounding area surrounding the kiln, the carbonization oven, and the scar of the kiln, etc., because of its relatively higher 20-meter resolution. And then finally, we also used very high resolution satellite imagery, such as worldview, but also planets, to detect the carbonization ovens, the kilns, or their scars by eye, because previous research has indicated that this is a possibility. So what we basically did was create two automated methods, classification methods, one for Landsat 8 and one for Sentinel-2. And we combined the output of these classification methods to get us closer to the locations where the chance is highest that charcoal production has actually occurred. And then we complemented this with the observation of charcoal kilns scars by eye. What this allowed us to do was map charcoal production sites with different gradients of robustness, basically. And here you can see sort of like a map that was produced for one of the villages, one extract of the village. You can basically see here with the Sentinel-2 and Landsat 8 outputs where they are overlapping. And the black area is basically charcoal production sites. So what these maps allowed us to do was to basically compare charcoal production sites in terms of their spatial characteristics between open access villages and communal management villages, to have an idea of how charcoal producers are using the forest to produce charcoal, basically. So basically, we looked at the sizes of charcoal production sites, for example, their densities, their distributions, but also the shapes of the sites, etc., to see, is there a difference in forest use for charcoal production between these two village types? Here you can see a small output of this study. Here you can see two box plots, one for the size of the harvesting area for charcoal production sites, and one for the shape of the harvesting area for charcoal production sites. And on the on the x-axis, you can see the different villages, basically. And what you can see from these results is that in open access villages, charcoal production sites are generally a little bit larger and more irregular in shape than those in open access villages. And generally, basically, charcoal production sites have much more variable shapes and sites in these open access villages than in these communal management villages. And this may indicate to us, basically, that there is somehow an effect of governance on the way that people use the forest. because we observe these differences. And it may actually also indicate that certain aspects of the harvesting plan are actually being implemented in these communal management villages, where charcoal producers start producing charcoal in smaller harvesting areas, perhaps, for example, in these 50 by 50 meter harvesting blocks that are spread around the landscape and are quite regular in shape, also maybe corresponding to this 50 by 50 meter plots, basically. However, what we also see is that the majority, according to our remote sensing study, at least 80 to 90% of the detected charcoal sites are actually located outside of the designated area for charcoal production in the communal management villages. And this may indicate that charcoal production is actually not in line with the harvesting plan with this regard, so that charcoal production occurs outside of this designated areas. And basically what this indicates is that we do find some effects of governance on charcoal production patterns in terms of their sizes and shapes, but that they are not necessarily in line with the harvesting plan. And the question is now what this means for forest regeneration and biodiversity. Question is, for example, is it better that charcoal is produced in a smaller, more regularly shaped sites where not all the trees are cut to produce charcoal, for example? Is that better for biodiversity and forest regeneration, or is it very much better to produce in these designated areas for charcoal production and leave the remaining forest alone? So this is really a question that is raised based on this study. Now, what this results for remote sensing also indicates is that there are challenges in the implementation of communal management at the local scale. It seems at least that there are some challenges here. And there can be many different reasons for these challenges. But for the purpose of this presentation, I would like to focus on two potential reasons that we may find in the livelihood data that we gathered. So there might be two livelihood capitals related to actually the mismatch between the policy goals and reality in terms of communal management. The first one is related to social capital, because social capital is very important, like I said before, for good governance of the forest and a communal management. It really relies on these dense social networks. And it may be that there is actually a lack of dense social networks locally in these villages, which may result in more ineffective governance and management of the forests. However, what might also happen is that charcoal producers may be unable to acquire enough income to support themselves when they only produce in these designated areas and may be forced to produce outside of these designated areas. So there might also be an implication in the financial capital of charcoal producers. Now, to assess this, we return to our livelihoods data that you have seen before and take a look first at social capital. So here you can see the social capital indicators. And what you can observe is that, again, for social capital in communal management villages, their social capital is a little bit higher than in these open access villages. So basically what we see in our livelihoods data is that charcoal producers in communal management villages cooperate a little bit more with each other during charcoal production than those in open access villages. And what we also see is that charcoal producers in communal management villages are a lot more involved in associations, such as charcoal producers associations, where they can make shared decisions together, than in open access villages. So this may indicate actually that the ingredients, the social capital, is actually present to foster effective governance of the forest under communal management. Now, to dive a little bit deeper into this, we decided to assess these social networks in a little bit more detail. So here you can see some of the outputs of the social network study, where you can see the open access villages, social networks of charcoal producers above, and then below the social networks for communal management villages for the 6 village types. And basically, one of the dots represents a charcoal producer, and then the lines between these dots, the gray lines between these dots, represent a collaboration between these charcoal producers. So these charcoal producers produce charcoal together. What can already be observed from basically these visual inputs alone is that in open access villages, charcoal producers relatively limitedly collaborate with each other. And that is likely because there is not so much of a need to produce together, because charcoal can be carried out quite on an individual scale, for example. And also what may happen is that charcoal production is quite informal, often illegal in these open access villages, which may not create a very trustful environment for these charcoal producers. Now, in communal management villages, we see something different. We see that charcoal producers really collaborate quite intensively with each other and form these sort of like quite dense and decentralized social networks. We most likely this is very much attributable to the governance that is implemented, the communal management that is implemented, because this allows for formalization of interactions to training schemes where charcoal producers are taught to produce charcoal, but also these charcoal producer associations where charcoal producers come together, and the participatory forestry scheme in general, where a lot of collaboration is required for the production of charcoal. So basically, we see here that an indication of the success of the project on this aspect, on fostering dense social networks and a lot of collaborations between charcoal producers that allows for effective governance. So basically, that means that we can at least partially cross out this potential reason, which brings us to the financial capital indicators. Now, when we take another look at the livelihoods data, we can see that for the financial capital indicators, there is actually a spike for one of the indicators in open access villages. And this is a spike for one of the financial capital indicators that indicates the income charcoal producers obtain per bag. And basically what happens in these villages is that charcoal producers obtain a certain fee, a certain income per bag of charcoal. And we see that this is higher for open access villages than for communal management villages. We can see that a little bit more clearly in this graph here, where you can see the income per bag per charcoal producer on the y-axis and the villages again on the x-axis. And you can see that there is quite a separation between the CB villages and the OFA villages concerning the income that they derive per bag. This is likely very much just related to tax collection for forest management and development. So what we can see from these results is that local governments are likely very effective in the collection of taxes from charcoal production. So what happens in these communal management villages is that the local government actually attracts the buyers to the villages and then receives the payment per charcoal bags from these buyers, including tax, and then they transfer the part of this money, part of the income that they receive, to the charcoal producers, which receive then their specific payment for per bag, and then the remaining tax is basically invested by the village in forest management and also in development. While in open access villages, charcoal production is often illegal, and charcoal producers often interact with charcoal with the buyers of charcoal bags directly, allowing these buyers basically to sort of like provide these charcoal producers with higher prices per bags, because they don't have to pay so many, because the buyers usually don't really pay so many taxes. Now, what we can also observe is that as a consequence of a loss of income per bag, charcoal producers may actually start to produce more charcoal bags per year. And this is just an indication that we find in the data, which needs to be further explored. But basically, when we take a look at this new box plot, we can see the number of charcoal bags per year per charcoal producer on the y-axis. and the villages on the x-axis. And what we can see is that for 2 of the communal management villages, the number of bags that charcoal producers produce per year is actually relatively higher than in the open access villages. So what a question this raises is whether this finding could perhaps explain charcoal production outside of the designated area. The question is really whether it may be that charcoal producers feel forced to produce outside of the designated area to make sure that they can obtain enough income from charcoal production, for example. And therefore start to produce a little bit more bags per year, for example. This also leaves again the question whether what the implications are for forest regeneration, biodiversity, and other types of ecosystem services, for example. And because based on our results, we can unfortunately not really say anything about the sustainability, the exact sustainability of these forest practices in these communal management villages on the forests in the village, the exact forest growth and exploitation in the village. So to conclude, we basically show that governance transitions have actually significant effects on forest use for charcoal production and also on charcoal producer livelihoods. First of all, we theoretically see that governance transitions can actually have the potential basically to foster sustainable forest use and allow at the same time for continuation of charcoal production. So theoretically, these governance transitions may work very well. However, what we also find is that on a large scale, governance has very limited effects on charcoal production. So this indicates that there is basically a need to foster more effective governance, for example, by implementing these governance transitions in a more effective way and really trying to assess, okay, what works and what does not work, and how can we move forward. That is why we decided to conduct a local field study to assess the effects of these governance transitions, in this case from these more unregulated open access systems to more regulated communal management systems on forest use and the livelihoods of charcoal producers. And what we find is that governance transitions to communal management actually have quite a big effect on both forest use and charcoal producer livelihoods. However, what we also find is that forest use and livelihoods are not really affected in exactly the way that was intended. So we see actually mismatches between governance goals and reality occurring when we implement, which we can basically learn from. And with that said, I would really like to emphasize that this is very normal. It is very difficult to foster such governance transitions, especially to communal management. And we see actually that there are many things that actually work, except that they are not necessarily always going into the direction that is intended. And I hope that with this research, we can actually get a step closer to perhaps further improving such governance and also informing other types of governance to see, okay, how can we make sure that we can continue to adapt these policies to local circumstances. And I think Eleanor Ostrom said this very nicely. She basically said that instead of thinking about the choice of institutions, about laws, rules, and regulations, basically as a one-shot decision in a known environment, we need to think about it as an ongoing investment process in an uncertain environment where you constantly have a look at, okay, how is my policy doing? How can I adapt? And I think that is really true for any policy, including this one. And that is why I wanted to just provide this food for thought at the end of this presentation for this specific issue. With that said, I would like to thank all of my co-authors and collaborators, especially the charcoal producers, members of village councils, and members of the district government of Kilosa for their help and their interest in the research and also their participation in the research. I would like to thank my colleagues of University of Zurich, especially my supervisor, Maria Santos, who has been really helping me out so much and really being a great supervisor to me. I would also like to thank my colleagues from Sokini University of Agriculture, especially Vincent Viamana, who was very much involved in the research, as well as Wilson Mugasha, Moshim Bambela, and Jamal Django. I'd like to thank Forest Conservation Group, especially Charles Meshak and Charles Leonard, as well as Sophia, for helping us out and allowing us to conduct research in the area. And also I would like to thank Tiani Mompamba from the University of Mexico, because she had been involved in the research from the very start and provided many insights. And then finally, I would like to thank all of my friends and family and colleagues. It has been an amazing time, and I've learned so much, and I appreciate you all very, very much. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch with all of you and sharing many nice experiences with you. Thank you very much. And are there any questions? If you have any questions for me, you can, of course, contact me on LinkedIn. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you hopefully learned something perhaps and have an idea now of what a PhD includes sometimes. And I hope that this was basically interesting to you, and I'm looking forward to your comments and your discussion. Thank you very much.